Hi everyone, my name is Susie and I'm the information scientist on staff at Lineberger. I've been in this position since March of 2019, which was shortly after Susan Cassie retired. Susan, as I'm sure some of you will remember, was a part-time librarian who admittedly loved working on compliance issues. I was fortunate that she remained on the payroll for a few months after her retirement to help work on making publications compliant for the core grant submission. So it's thanks to her wisdom and her guidance that I am able to provide this training to you. So let's start with this question. What is compliance? When we talk about compliance, it's really shorthand for saying that a particular paper is subject to the NIH Public Access Policy, and it requires a PMC ID. I pasted here the text from the policy, which you are welcome to read, but what it boils down to is that all papers that result from NIH-funded projects are required to be openly available to the public. And for that to happen, the full text must be deposited into PubMed Central. It's important to note that PubMed and PubMed Central are actually two separate databases. PubMed contains citations, while PubMed Central contains both citations and full text articles. So that's why compliant publications have a PMC ID as well as a PMID. So why does this matter? There's a little bit of a carrot and a little bit of a stick here. The carrot is that access to PubMed Central doesn't require an institutional affiliation. So those of us here who are UNC employees have access to many journals through the UNC libraries, but of course not everybody has that luxury. So this ensures access to quality peer-reviewed research to all taxpayers. And I'm sure that many of you have had first-hand experience with the proverbial stick here, which is that non-compliant publications can delay funding, and no one wants to submit an RPPR with a publication that's out of compliance. Now, I want to assure you of a few things that compliance is not. It's not scary, I promise. The staff at the National Library of Medicine, they want to make sure that your paper is compliant just as much as you do. So if you submit something incorrectly, they won't turn into Pennywise the Clown. At the very most, they might email you and ask you to resubmit with an additional file or something like that. When Susan Cassie was here, I do think she made it seem like compliance was magic, but because my role has evolved from hers, I am here to provide guidance and empower you to perform the steps that turn a non-compliant paper into a compliant one. And I promise that you don't need to be David Blaine to get a paper into compliance. So I hope that I can demystify that for you and convince you by the end of this tutorial that compliance is neither scary nor magic. Here's a broad overview of the compliance pipeline, as I'm calling it. I will cover the steps in more detail in the following slides, but if you're like me and you like to see the big picture, sort of where things came from and where they're going, this might be helpful to you. So step one, deposit files. Final manuscripts are deposited into the NIH manuscript system, or NIMS, as I will refer to it from here on out. And those are deposited by either the author, a PI, a publisher, or sometimes a third party. Step two, the deposited files are reviewed and approved by an assigned reviewer. The individual here must be either an author or PI. Step three, we don't have much to do with this step on our end. The good folks at NIMS will convert the uploaded files into an archival format for PubMed Central. Step four, preferably the same reviewer from step two will review the converted files. And if they're approved, the manuscript moves into step five when a PMC ID is assigned and the paper is considered compliant. I've also added a brief glossary here, just in case these names or these acronyms get a little confusing. So let's talk about these steps in a bit more detail. In step one, you first want to ask if your paper requires a PMC ID. And before we go further, I'll issue a little bit of a disclaimer. The details provided here will apply to most situations, But if you ever encounter anything that seems unusual, please feel free to reach out to me or the Health Sciences Library. Hopefully, though, this will cover the vast majority of compliance projects that you'll work on. So the first question is about NIH funding. If you know for certain that a paper did not receive NIH funding and will never be reported in our PPR, you can mark this paper exempt in your NCBI or My Bibliography. When we were working on papers submitted with the core grant, we retroactively attributed some of them as having been funded in part by the core grant, and so we needed to initiate the compliance process for them. So that's just something that you might want to be aware of. So assuming that there was NIH funding, the next question asks if the paper was peer reviewed. Some publications like letters, editorials, errata, and corrections are not peer reviewed and can also be exempted. Assuming the paper was peer reviewed, was it written in a Latin script? This could be English, Spanish, French, Italian, German, any number of languages. But papers written in non-Latin scripts, like Russian or Japanese, can be exempted. So if you answered yes to all of these questions, then your paper is subject to the policy and does require a PMCID. So let's assume that your paper does require one. And if it has not yet been deposited into NIMS, you'll need to determine the submission method. I provided a flow chart here that can help you determine which method applies. And I know this was confusing when I started working on compliance. So I'm hopeful that this will help. So basically there are 4 methods. Method A, we like method A because those journals will submit on your behalf. No questions asked, that's just by default. Method B journals too will submit on your behalf, but they require additional arrangements like paying for an open access fee. Method D publishers will submit on your behalf, but in my experience, they sometimes will require a reminder to do this. So I'll include a sample email template that you can use to contact them with the rest of the training materials that I'm providing here. And also at the end of this slide deck, I'll provide some links to search the methods A, B, and D journals and publishers so you can determine which submission method might apply. Method C requires you to deposit the final manuscript, and anyone can deposit, including the author, a PI, or a third party like an administrative assistant. So here are some common questions that I've received about depositing files. So first of all, how can I check to see if paper has been deposited into NIMS? So you can look in a couple of places. The first is in NCBI or My Bibliography. So you can add a paper to your My Bibliography or one for an investigator for whom you are a delegate. And there you can view the public access compliance status. Or you can look in NIMS. And you can either enter a PMID or a DOI to search NIMS to see if a paper has been deposited. The next question, who can deposit files? I think we've already answered that. Anybody can submit. However, an author or the PI must serve as the reviewer. I've been asked to submit a manuscript for one of my faculty members. How soon should I submit? I say as soon as possible. So the policy calls for the peer-reviewed accepted manuscript to be deposited into NIMS at the time of acceptance for publication. It is actually marked as non-compliant 90 days out from publication, that publication date. So getting started on it sooner is always best. My paper is under embargo. Should I still submit right away? Absolutely yes. PubMed Central will list the paper as available on, and then they'll have the date that it's available. But in the meantime, while it's under embargo, the citation will be there, just not the full text. And finally, how long does it take for the PMCID to be assigned once I have submitted my manuscript? The submission process is currently estimated to be 6 to 8 weeks long. So that's why we suggest submitting just as soon as possible. Okay, so after the files are deposited, the assigned reviewer must review and approve them. So this individual, as I mentioned before, must be an author on the paper or a PI on a grant that has been associated with the paper. In addition to reviewing the files for accuracy and completion, this person must also sign off on the submission statement. And that basically attests that the reviewer is an author on the paper and that they have retained the right to deposit the final manuscript into PubMed Central. So one common problem that we encountered when we were preparing papers for the core grant was getting in contact with the assigned reviewers who had left the university or were simply unresponsive. And when this happened, we contacted the NIMS help desk to have the paper reassigned to another author or the PI. And if this happens to you, I suggest contacting the NIMS help desk as well. Or if you're able to log in using the credentials of one of the authors, so if you yourself are an author, or if one of your faculty members has granted you access, you can actually request to claim the paper in NIMS. Once the initial approval has been completed, the good folks at NIMS will convert the files into archival documents. During this step, they will review for completion, and they might reach back out to the reviewer to resubmit with additional or corrected files. One common reason for resubmission is to request a missing table or appendix or something like that. So this step can take a few weeks. So feel free to grab a cup of coffee or grab a cup of tea and sit back and relax. I might also suggest that you put a reminder on your calendar to check NIMS periodically, just in case the notification email is lost or overlooked. Okay, so step 4, after the files are converted, a second notification email will be sent to the reviewer. The reviewer should check to make sure that the formatting looks good. Susan mentioned to me that this rarely happens, but sometimes formatting can be misaligned in the conversion process. In one case, she actually noticed some numbering and a bibliography was offset and it needed to be corrected. So it's always a good idea to review this with a sharp eye. And once the final version has been approved, NIMS will assign a PMC ID, thus making the paper fully compliant. So it might take an additional day or two for the full text to appear in PubMed Central, but as long as the PMC ID is active, the paper is considered fully compliant, and we all rejoice. Okay, so to recap, if you have a paper that is not currently compliant, here are some questions that will help you troubleshoot how to either get the paper started in or moving down the pipeline. Has the manuscript been deposited to NIMS? If not, determine the submission method and get those files deposited. Has the initial approval been completed by the reviewer? If not, you might want to email the reviewer. If you know them, just give them a little nudge. Or if it is a reviewer that is no longer responsive or affiliated with the university, you might need to look into getting that paper reassigned to a different reviewer. Is the status NIMS conversion? If it is, just sit tight. Everything is normal. This might take a few days, so just check back. Has the reviewer completed the final review? If not, just like in that step 2, email the reviewer or get it reassigned if necessary. And if it has, then the PMC will be assigned soon, and you'll see it in PubMed Central in a couple of days. So as promised, here are some links to determine which journals and publishers fall under the different submission methods. And again, I know this was confusing for me when I first started working with compliance, so if you do have questions, we can work through them together. Also listed here are some links to tutorials through NIMS, and they give you a little bit more in-depth step-by-step through the system itself. And although this information doesn't change too frequently, they do update their site to reflect these changes, so it might be worth bookmarking for future issues. And finally, while I am usually here to help provide assistance, compliance is only one part of my job, and I often get pulled into other projects here at the center. So if you ever contact me and I have an out-of-office message, or I can't get to you as quickly as you need me, the Health Sciences Library is here to help. They are quite well versed in compliance issues. I've asked them lots of questions myself, and they always respond promptly. So it's a great resource to have. So hopefully I've convinced you that compliance work is nothing to fear. And once you start working on it regularly, it should become a lot easier. But in the meantime, if you do have questions or if you want to talk through how you might make this a regular part of your workflow, thinking proactively rather than reactively, please do feel free to contact me. I can be reached by email or Teams chat or Skype, or, I might be thinking optimistically, but when we return to campus, I can be found in Lineberger 11-128. So thank you so much for your time, and I am curious to know what your experiences are like.